Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to another Monday evening right here at We the People, presented by the Diamond Factory. The diamondfactory.org is actually a directory where we will be directing people low resources and income uh, to where they can get help for their particular situation, be it homelessness, psychological, uh, abusive situations, whatever. Our aim is to be the number one directory for the homeless and, as I said, those that are lacking resources. So, getting all of that commercial stuff out of the way, you can see our Cash App right here is a dollar sign JEK. It's I. All donations, of course, go to help us put on programs such as this. Tonight, we have a very special guest, Miss Amanda, excuse me, Amanda Eunice-Kessler. And I'm bringing you up here after I butchered her name. But good evening. How are you this evening, Amanda? You chastised me the last time, so I'm going to make sure I call you Amanda.
That's fine. I'm fine. How are you?
I'm doing fine. I was looking forward to tonight's question and answer period because you brought a different version of DEI other than what we normally uh, think of it in terms of. And I thought that was also a very interesting viewpoint because it completely changed our interview questions once you had sent me that particular note. So, with that, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience first, and then we'll get to the show.
Absolutely. So I am a sociologist by academic training, and I work sociologically in the areas of inequality of different sorts, racism, sexism, heterosexism, and so on, and also in the sociology of religion. Um, I have written several books. One of my other main side gigs is actually as a musician and composer, songwriter, hymn writer. So part of my engagement with trying to make the world a better place is through creating truly inclusive, justice-focused worship music. Um, I also create liturgy. I've done just a number of things in the world of religion. Um, I also do anti-racism trainings as a white person for white people. I also do creativity trainings as someone who has created a lot of music and a lot of writing in my life, and I love the creative process. Um, and one of my latest new gigs is actually consulting with churches to help them deepen their inclusiveness in their liturgical language or worship language. So, in prayers, in hymns, in responsive readings, things like that. So, I do a range of things, all hopefully to make the world a better, more just, more kind, and more joyful place.
I've noticed a lot of the people lately on my show, especially concerning this and other social topics, happen to be musicians. Uh, I'm not sure if that's a coincidence. Maybe it's the creative thinking process. But I do have one request. Can we have some new and kind of updated Christmas carols?
So I have written a few actually, as it happens. Um, I have two worship songs for Blue Christmas services that are about acknowledging the pain of the season for some people. And I have a Christmas carol called The Manger is Stranger, which is in a fair amount of use. It's available for free on my music website. I'm happy to provide information about that later.
Oh, thank you. I will be glad for you to talk about that as we go on. But let's start the first segment here talking about a faith rooted in justice. And you've written books on ethics, inclusion, and inequality. So let's start with your faith. What does progressive Christianity mean to you, and what drew you to it as a spiritual and moral framework?
Sure. So I think of progressive Christianity as a commitment to following in the way of Jesus that is not dependent on doctrine, blood atonement theories, religious exclusivism, or the rejection of reason or science. And specifically, it's a focus on Jesus as a Jewish prophet, calling people to a moral life of justice work and a spiritual life of connection with other people and with the sacred, however we understand the sacred. Um, I did not grow up in this tradition. I grew up a secular Jew in New York City. I found my way here partly actually because as a queer person growing up in New York City, my first encounter with Christianity was that it was really homophobic and kind of spiritually violent. And I think that actually kind of awakened a yearning in me for some kind of spiritual life that would work for me. Um, my next encounter with Christianity was through music directing a production of Godspell, which is a really beautiful musical about community and gratitude and joy and learning together and growing together. Um, because I didn't think Christianity could be for me, I spent many years with the Unitarian Universalists. I actually went to seminary to become a minister in that tradition, but eventually found my way to the United Church of Christ, which is a quite liberal Christian denomination in the US. The two other things I'd say about this quickly are first, I don't know that I would say that I believe in Jesus, which most Christians would say, but rather I believe him, or maybe better, I believe his message of love and compassion, caring for the least of these, and so on. And that's kind of the spiritual piece. But morally, there's this prophetic demand for justice. It runs through the Old Testament, and it was important to Jesus as well. And justice in the Jewish tradition of which Jesus was a part does mean fairness, but it also means lifting up members of devalued communities. And so while plenty of white people can strive to work against racism for completely secular reasons, which is great, for me, part of the call of Jesus is to acknowledge my own racism, the ways I benefit from racism, to repent of it, and to try to uh, make the world a place where more members of BIPOC communities can flourish.
Now, excuse me. In Abundant Lives, you outline a progressive Christian ethic, flourishing. What does this mean to flourish in a world that is shaped by injustice? And how does your ethics work to try to push back against that?
Yeah, in the book, I talk about flourishing as the situation where we are encouraged and also enabled to become our whole best selves, to live lives of joy, gratitude, humility, and contributions to the flourishing of other people. And in the book Abundant Lives, I specify what this looks like in terms of the different attributes that make us human. The one I talk about the most is embodiment, because this is pretty straightforward. We all have bodies. Our bodies are crucial to our lives. We can flourish in our bodies, we can also suffer in our bodies, and so on. So if we think about our bodies, certain preconditions need to be in place for us to flourish. Um, and if they're not in place, we probably won't flourish and we might suffer. So we need survival resources. We need access to medical care. We need freedom from harm and violence. We need some degree of bodily autonomy so that we can live whatever our own best embodied life is. And when we think about injustice, what we're really talking about is the fact that some groups of people have access to resources, opportunities, and experiences that are positive and helpful and good and that help them flourish, and that other groups of people don't have access to those resources. And also that the members of devalued groups, in fact, also face all sorts of penalties, physical harm and danger, surveillance, policing, mistreatment that members of valued groups don't. In our society today, in fact, you can tell who the valued groups are to the current government because they're the ones whose rights matter. The rest of us, our rights don't matter very much to some of those in power. But because of the way that injustice works, I don't think members of devalued groups really get to flourish very much at all. So if we stick with embodiment, for example, we see all the ways that racism harms and destroys BIPOC bodies. Sexism harms and destroys female bodies. Heterosexism harms and destroys queer bodies, and so on. So flourishing is hard to come by in a world shaped by injustice. Suffering is a lot more common. And since my ethical vision is of a world full of flourishing and with as little avoidable suffering as possible, I have to work against injustice in any way I can. I think there's one other important thing to say, though, here, which is even though injustice mostly harms members of devalued groups, BIPOC communities, women, and so on, even members of valued groups lose out under injustice and inequality, and we don't talk about that enough. So Ralph Ellison once wrote in this wonderful essay that was in the New Yorker magazine in like 1948, he wrote, "This is a world in which the major energy of the imagination goes not into creating works of art, but into overcoming the frustrations of social discrimination," by which he meant racial discrimination. And so if we sort of stick with that, the incredible artistic contributions in this country and in the world of members of BIPOC communities are magnificent and incredible. And imagine how many more of them there would be without racism. So even someone as white-skinned as me suffers in a sense, or at least doesn't live as rich a life as I might because of all those people who were not able to create their art or their music or to cure cancer or whatever it might be because of the ways that inequality works. Um, and also, members of valued groups suffer when they or we, if we're talking about race, live with a scarcity mindset driven by fear in which resources or status are zero sum and they have to be hoarded. So white people hoard resources and status to make sure that uh, members of BIPOC communities don't get access to them. We see a lot of that with the current federal government. And this is a horrible way to live in fear, to live with a scarcity mindset. That's not about joy. That's not about gratitude or flourishing. That's just tragic. So inequality is tragic in a way for all of us.
Uh, Before I get to my questions, I do want to go on with the current topic for people that are unfamiliar with cultural processes. Can you explain how racism, sexism, and heterosexualism
Mhm.
is how it works in everyday life, not just through institutions, but through values, language, and norms?
Sure. So in the book, I define, and I should say this is a different book than the book I mentioned before. This book is called Cultural Processes of Inequality. And I define culture in it as shared understandings, those beliefs, ideas, and values that we hold in common, the shared assumptions underlying them, and the norms, rules, and laws that emerge from those shared understandings. So that way of thinking about culture, I think, really speaks directly to your question. Institutional discrimination is pretty easy to understand. There's a lot of academic literature on it. We see it in the paper every day. So we know how uh, racist discrimination works in the criminal justice system. We know how heterosexist discrimination works in the housing market, how sexist discrimination works in hiring and all that. But none of that literature ever explains why anyone discriminates in the first place. So people have institutional decision-making power. A police officer can decide to pull over a particular driver or not. Why do police officers keep pulling over BIPOC drivers and so rarely pull over white drivers? Why do mortgage loan officers who have the institutional authority to give a loan, to a couple trying to buy a house, why do they give heterosexual couples more money on better terms than same-sex couples? Or employers who have the authority to hire new people for their companies, when researchers send in identical resumes with only the gender of the applicant varied, the employers hire men over and over and over again. Why, when the resumes are otherwise identical? So we need to understand what's driving the discrimination, which is where I think the cultural piece comes in. So what I think we're dealing with is shared assumptions about who is more competent, more trustworthy, more moral, more harmless or dangerous, and so on. And those assumptions, I think, drive a lot of that discrimination, because those assumptions are kind of built around group identities. So in the US, for example, we know that Blackness has been criminalized. So white people have been taught to assume that an African American person is a criminal. It's a horrible thing that we have been taught, but we all know it's true. But it's also true that criminality has been racialized. So white people are also taught to assume that if someone is a criminal, if there's a criminal in the story, they're not likely to be white. They're likely to be, say, Black or Hispanic. And once those assumptions are in place, institutional decision makers tend to act in ways that reinforce the assumption or the stereotype. So my favorite example of this is driving while Black or brown. And it's my favorite example because I am an inveterate speeder. In the past 20-something years since I moved to Colorado Springs, I estimated once that I've sped over 25,000 times, and in front of police cars at least 50. And I've gotten one speeding ticket since 2003. And that's because of my whiteness. I just never get stopped because I'm white and I drive a white lady car. So when police officers keep pulling Black and brown people over and search their cars looking for contraband, so drugs, illicit money, guns, whatever, sometimes they'll find it because some people are driving around with contraband. And if they keep pulling BIPOC drivers over, they're going to find some contraband. Well, if they never pull white people over, they're never going to find our contraband. I don't actually carry contraband, but they won't find contraband in white cars if they don't stop white drivers. And so they never get to test their assumption or their hypothesis that dark-skinned people are criminals, because they never do the experiment. They never look at the control group. They never actually find out what percentage of white people are carrying contraband. Now, the research shows us that white people are more likely than BIPOC people to have contraband in their cars, amazingly. But again, the police don't know that because they never look into it. So that's kind of the principle behind the idea that there's a cultural component to inequality. A couple of specific kinds of cultural processes. One of them is moral alchemy. This is a term we get from a mid-20th century sociologist. And he defines moral alchemy as the situation where the same action is defined as good when members of valued groups do it, and as bad when members of devalued groups do it. So it's not that the action has changed, it's that who's doing it is either more or less regarded in the society. So marriage is great for heterosexuals. Our society tries to support marriage for heterosexuals. But when same-sex couples want to get married, we weren't even allowed to do that until, 10 years ago or so, and that right is back under threat. Or take gender. A male supervisor who has a take charge attitude is praised for being a strong leader. A female supervisor with a take charge attitude is called all sorts of names that I can't say on this show because they're really not very nice. Or if we want to go with a racial example, if a college wants to offer preferential admission to legacy students, these are white students generally whose parents went to the college as well. So that's generally thought of as fine. But preferential admission for BIPOC students is called affirmative action and is slandered, and the current government's trying to make it illegal and all of that. So those are some examples of moral alchemy. They're cultural processes driven by assumptions in which some people get treated better than others. there are any number of other ones I could talk about. I'll stick briefly just to two more.
Well,
I'll stop there
no,
so
no,
we can go on.
go ahead because I have a couple questions here for you that
Oh, okay.
yeah, but go ahead,
All right.
with your point.
All right. So victim blaming, let's just stick with that. When something bad happens to a person, if the person that something bad happens to is a member of a devalued group, um, they tend to be blamed for being victimized. If they're a member of a valued group, then the bad thing that happened to them is seen as a bad thing, and whoever did it is held accountable. But we have plenty of evidence that, for example, um, police violence against BIPOC communities, white people tend to blame that violence on the communities, not on the police carrying out the violence. When women get raped, people tend to blame the women and ask, what did she do that led her to get raped? Instead of asking, why'd the guy rape her? So I'll stop it there, though.
Okay, um, because I grew up, even though I veered very far off the path, but I grew up as a preacher's kid, and it was mainly based in Baptist and then African uh, Methodist Episcopal.
Mhm.
And then later, when I went to a foster home, it was the Episcopal Church.
Mm.
But here's when you go back to faith, and especially when you're talking to someone of my generation, um, in the Old Testament, Sodom and Gomorrah was burned, and activities that you're talking about were shunned, unless, of course, it was the music director for the church. But how do you get to the point where people that who you say their faith, their justice is based in their faith? Well, that faith that they put in the Old Testament no longer applies. We are in a different age. We are in a different state of mind as far as faith-based activities. As you say, same-sex marriage. I mean, in 1968, are you kidding me? Please. So, how do we reconcile the faith that we've had for the last, in my case, 70 years or more,
Okay.
with the current situation?
So that, I think, has to do with how a religious community interacts with scripture, with the Bible. Um, if one grows up seeing the Bible as literally the word of God in the sense that it is infallible, everything in it is equally true, and so on, then certainly, if that is what one sees, then it would seem to be hard in some ways to uh, understand how someone can be a same-sex loving Christian, for example. Um, but I think my both my academic training in religion and my personal path have never relied on a literal reading of the Bible. And so we might personally sort of disagree theologically or religiously in any number of ways. Um, but I feel very comfortable saying we know that human beings wrote the Bible down. We know that the Bible is made up of 66 books that were written over a couple thousand years, practically, at least 1,000 years. And that some of the things in it reflected the cultural context of the time. I mean, at virtually no point in the Bible, for example, does it say explicitly slavery is morally wrong and should be eliminated. And so there is, even though obviously same-sex relationships is kind of a topic today that we could sort of talk about how we engage the Bible with, but even your own community's history, there were struggles for generations among different Christians over whether slavery was morally bad or morally good. That is a morally unacceptable struggle. Slavery is bad. Slavery is bad because it
Hey, it teaches
oppresses,
you new
hurts.
skills. I mean, it teaches you new skills. It teaches you how to get along with people. It
I'm
teaches you how to work together.
I'm glad you have a sense of humor. That's all I'm going to say, sir. No, but so I think in every age we encounter the Bible through our own eyes, or if we're in other religious traditions, whatever the scripture of that tradition would be. But we have to ask, you know, is every detail in the Bible equally important, or is there kind of a central through line? And for me, the absolute end of the conversation is in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, verses 28 to 34, when the scribe asks Jesus what the most important commandment is. And remember, Jesus is a Jew, the scribe is a Jew, so he's asking Jesus, of the 613 commandments in the Torah, what is the most important commandment? And Jesus says, well, being Jesus, he has to complicate things. So he says there are two commandments, not one. One of them is love God, one of them is love your neighbor. So what does Jesus not say? He does not say sexual purity. He does not say food prohibitions. He does not say specific worship practices. He does not say, what is the penalty if you're fighting with your neighbor and you knock out his tooth? And I mean, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Torah, and again, I'm a Jew by heritage, there are commandments for everything. And Jesus does not lift up a particular prohibition and say, you must not do this. That's the most important thing. Instead, he says, love, 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 love. Love your neighbor as yourself, love God. Elsewhere in the Gospels, he says, love your enemies. So for me, it keeps coming back to love. And so we have to ask what love means. We can talk about that if you like. I do have a way of talking about love relevant to these books, but um, I don't think oppressing any group of people ever is loving.
Oh, we 100% agree. But in some cases, I'm trying to be, like you said, my sense of humor, because when at my age, when I hear these things, it's like, you know fingernails on a chalkboard. I think I'm
Hmm.
back in 1972 or somewhere. You know, but so I might throw you out some devilish questions every once in a while. My middle name is Eris, so if you're familiar with Greek mythology, that means the Greek god of mischief. So. Uh,
I look forward to it.
so let's go on talking here, continue on our conversation, and we're going to talk about inequality, politics, and the white response. So let's start off talking about the 2024 election. What cultural forces of inequality, particularly around race and gender, do you think shaped the political landscape, excuse me, even beneath the headlines?
So before I answer that, I have to say voter suppression played a huge role in that election, and that is not a cultural process, but we can't ignore that it happened. But now, to get to your question, I mentioned before that there are a number of assumptions that tend to undergird inequality, like racism and sexism. And I mentioned competence, morality, innocence, dangerousness. We could add trustworthiness to that. And I think all of those were in play. And so what happened was, the Republicans were extremely clever and smart at basically um, uh, presenting their opponents as incompetent, immoral, untrustworthy, dangerous, and so on. I mean, literally, they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs. I mean, you can't get a better example of it than that. And so they were able to paint the Democrats as the party of them, not us. And them, of course, in their context meant BIPOC people, women, sexual minorities, and so on. Interestingly, the fact that the Republicans lied their way through the election season never somehow marked them as immoral, which I find interesting. Um, but at the heart of really any kind of inequality is what has been called moral exclusion. The idea that there are some people who fall outside our moral community. They don't need to be treated fairly. They don't need justice. They don't deserve rights, and so on. And what we have seen, both in the election season and since the inauguration, is just massive moral exclusion, in which the Republicans have said, we are for you, our base. You are the real Americans. You are the legitimate people. You deserve to be treated well. All of them, all the Democrats, all the BIPOC people, all the women, and so on and so on. Those people are Democrats, and they're bad, and they don't deserve to be treated well, and they're not on your side. So the Republicans were really able to do this us-them thing very, very successfully. I just mentioned moral alchemy. Well, the Republicans were able to say whatever we want to do is good. Whatever they want to do is bad. It's going to be bad for you, the voters. And really, enough of their people bought their perspective, because those people were also operating out of racism and sexism and so on. And so it was not a hard sell, I think, to say, to convince their voters that the Democrats represent everything that's wrong with the world. You should trust us because we represent what's good. And so basically, they just made racism and sexism and some other forms of inequality core to their election message. And along with the voter suppression, it kind of worked.
I would say more than kind of,
Well, yeah.
when you consider the man in the White House.
Yeah.
But uh, you're clear that you're not a corporate DEI consultant, but a sociologist uh, and an ethnicist. So now, in that context, how do you view the backlash against DEI from both an analytical and a moral perspective? I mean, I think we can use the guy down in Florida for perhaps an example of this.
We could. I mean, analytically or sociologically, this is just a straightforward example of racist and sexist opportunity hoarding. It's a bunch of white men who want to keep valued and opportunities and resources for themselves. They don't want other people to have access to them. And so um, the backlash against DEI is a way to narrow the competition so that they don't have to compete against so many qualified people. And we should be really careful about one thing. When you look at the kind of justifications for trying to end DEI, they often talk about meritocracy. They say, we want to get rid of this affirmative action and get rid of DEI and go back to meritocracy. And we just need to know that this is a complete joke. The white men who are being elevated to powerful positions in the federal government, and most of the white women, are far less competent than the people they're replacing, and they're certainly way less competent than the BIPOC people and most of the women they're replacing. So what we really are seeing is the opposition to DEI among this group is basically affirmative action for mediocre and incompetent white men and a few mediocre and incompetent white women. That's all it is. It's affirmative action the way we've always had it in this country since before it was a country. Affirmative action for white people, especially for white men, especially for heterosexual white Christian men. So analytically, that's kind of the most important piece. Morally, the backlash against DEI fails every ethical test I can think of. So to rattle off a few Western traditions of ethics, it fails the golden rule. It fails the utilitarian calculus about maximizing happiness. It fails the deontological categorical imperative that says something is only a moral rule if it can be universalized to all people. Virtue ethics, the idea that our actions should follow from the virtues we cultivate. The backlash against DEI completely fails that. There's no virtue in it anywhere. And certainly in terms of the ethics of flourishing that I've developed, the backlash against DEI fails that 100%. So to me, it is simply sort of the sociological reproduction of inequality, and ethically, it is a moral disaster.
Now, once again, if my facts are correct, the people that actually benefited most from DEI were white women, not
That's true.
women or biops.
Yeah, yeah. So in a way, it is a little unfortunate to try to talk about both the BIPOC community and women as two separate groups. That's
Right.
um, that is absolutely a problem, and I see that. Um, I think when I was thinking about it, my point was to say that most of the people who are going to wind up benefiting from the backlash are white men. But that I think that can be true, and it can still also be true that DEI has been more helpful for white women than for Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, and so on people. However, where I don't think disagree with you, but reframe it a little bit is the Republicans have created a narrative in which DEI is substantially about race and substantially about promoting unqualified members of BIPOC communities, not that they would ever use as respectful a phrase as that, BIPOC communities. Um, so even though in reality, yes, white women benefited more, but that's not really a big part of the Republican conversation these days, I think. I think really a lot of what they're doing is racist dog whistles.
I could agree. We absolutely agree on that. As I said, I might, it just seems, like sometimes, you're eating your own. When you're talking about Republicans, they want to, you know, project that it is the BIPOC community or minorities that are actually benefiting when that too is also a smokescreen. But going on as a white person offering anti-racism training for white people, you center uh, white discomfort as part of the problem. Why is that so important to name and work through that discomfort rather than avoiding it? And one of the reasons why I asked you this question is also goes back to my background. Uh, when we were, uh, as you say, it didn't matter whether you had the EEOC seal of approval or whatever. If you walked into an office and one of those people was of a different race other than white, you automatically had white privilege, regardless of what that EEOC or that Rights Act meant. And we knew that. And it was the same for women. Maybe not to the same extent, because well, maybe even more, because as I remember, there was also a period where women were basically stay home mothers. You didn't have both parents working and things of that nature. So how do you put all of those together when you talk about inequality and the white response? Because I felt as a black man we went through at least a decade of that response, and it filtered down even to our children. So how do you, when you talk about white response, how do you get over that initial fear of blackness?
Right. So I think there is no way to get over that without going right into the discomfort that we as white people have been taught taught to experience in relation to race. And I think there's two pieces of this. Um, to speak really frankly, I think many of us who are white were taught to be uncomfortable around uh, Black and Hispanic, Latino, and so on people. So there was just the direct racialized discomfort, but also we have been taught that talking about racism or even being willing to say there is racism and I as a white person benefit from it is just profoundly uncomfortable because it goes against this narrative that if we white people are nice people and if we have some Black friends or if we're activists or if we vote the right way or whatever, that we're not really racist. And my feeling is that white people can't do any effective work against racism if we can't tolerate some discomfort in kind of confronting these lies that we've been told, and these narratives that don't serve us, but that even more so don't serve communities of color. Because if we can't stand the discomfort of dealing with this, we're just going to retreat into immobilization and resentment and defensiveness and so on. And then we just stay part of the problem. So we have to have the resilience to stay in the struggle against racism as when, for example, we get called out for saying or doing something cringeworthy because we didn't realize it at the time, but it was racist. I mean, this happens to all white people who do this work. It's happened to me plenty of times. And so, you know, I could have fled screaming in the other direction any number of times. And instead, I think we have to be able to apologize when we who are white, say something racist, apologize, learn the lesson, not make the same mistakes again. And we have to have the humility to realize that this is not about our precious little egos. This is about like a systematic form of inequality that hurts and kills other people and that benefits us while it's hurting those other people. Now, there's a fairly well-known anti-racism trainer named Robin DiAngelo who's written about this before I have. She calls it white fragility. I think it's similar. And she points out that white fragility has been weaponized to distract white people from working against racism, because the second you're in an anti-racist training and some white person gets uncomfortable and starts to cry or gets angry or whatever, all of a sudden the attention is on making them feel better, not on the racism. And that's a huge problem. So she wrote about this years ago. But I think if we look at today's political climate, I think the weaponizing of white discomfort has become a really huge part of the larger right-wing grievance culture. Um, so I look at the MAGA movement today, and what I see is a lot of people who are just completely unable to engage with or manage their discomfort about social, political, cultural, and economic changes that have diminished their social status in ways they don't like. And I don't mean that they sort of all individually have less power than they used to. I mean, even just having a president who was Black was enough culturally to make them feel as though they'd been, cast aside. I think, even though this is oversimplifying, that white discomfort played a huge role in the 2024 election and therefore in the situation we're in right now. So white discomfort is bad in keeping individual white people from working against racism, but right now white discomfort is literally destroying our country.
What are some of the common misunderstandings that white people have about systematic racism? And what's the first step someone can take to begin dismantling uh, this misunderstanding in themselves?
So
And
I,
I find myself, these are words or a regurgitation of words that we heard in the late 70s and early 80s. Maybe we can go back even further than that, even though I was a child. McCarthyism. I mean, are we digressing?
yeah, so I think we are. Um, but I think to sort of try to go back to the first part of the question, the biggest misunderstanding white people have about systematic racism is about the fact that it's systematic. So white people are, I think, generally in this country taught to think of racism as being reducible to irrational prejudice against BIPOC people, or a racist is an individual who discriminates just personally. They discriminate because they're mean or they're stupid or something like that. And so these are ways of thinking about racism that make those of us who tend to be politically progressive and maybe a little more educated, they let us get ourselves off the hook for racism, because, hey, I'm a nice person, I'm diversity minded, I have a, my friends are of diverse racial backgrounds, and so on and so on. And so we can fail to see the institutional nature of racism, and also we can fail to see how universal it is. So if we are white, and this is controversial, if we are white, we are implicated in racism, no matter how nice or progressive or earnest we are. And so white work against racism is not going to be broadly effective until we white people can say, I am racist. Not I'm a mean person, not I actively choose to discriminate against people, but I benefit from racism. I still have some racist thoughts. I've been working on this stuff for 30 years and I still have some racist thoughts. Doesn't make me evil. I didn't choose to be racist. I learned it, but it doesn't matter. Now I have to work against it. And so where do we start? Where do white people start? Well, I think we start with a kind of personal accounting, a mix of self-education. So we have to teach ourselves about the history of racism and how racism works in society right now, in institutions, in interactions, and so on. And as we do that, um, we start also looking at the concrete ways in which we benefit from racism. And then we start wrestling with our discomfort. Once we start doing those things, then we're in a position to educate other people, to become activists, to give some of our money and resources and time and energy to anti-racist work and so on. But it's got to start with learning what's going on, seeing ourselves in it, how it benefits us, and beginning to wrestle with our discomfort, and then to use religious language for a moment to try to repent of the racism. And I don't mean flagellating ourselves. I mean, literally, the word repentance means turning around, taking a different path, starting over. So we start over. We start over by trying to make racism a thing of the past.
Much easier said than done. But but kind of you were talking about your work as a musician, and you did mention that you wrote hymns. Well, it's a little more than that because you're an award-winning hymn writer, and you contributed to what is it, a liturgy for all bodies? What inspires you to write music, and how can music challenge injustices rather than just soothe discomfort?
I'm so glad you wanted to ask that question. So ever since that production of Godspell, I mentioned music directing as a teenager, I have just become enamored of sacred music. Um, I find it really powerful and really meaningful. Music is one of my main gateways to spirituality. It moves me like almost nothing else does. Um, when I was starting out as a songwriter, I wrote really bad love songs, and later I wrote less bad but not great songs about justice. And over the years, what I've learned is just that my niche as a songwriter and therefore hymn writer is in writing progressive, inclusive, justice-focused sacred music. And I write a lot of it. And I write the music I need to hear. I write the music that will inspire me to keep trying to work for justice, and that reminds me, um, that this is something Jesus wanted us to do. Um, Now, I do think that sacred music has a completely legitimate role in soothing discomfort. I mean, worship in general and sacred music in particular they have two roles: to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And most of us are both afflicted in some ways and comfortable in others, whether that's personally or politically. So I do write some music that's about soothing discomfort, but honestly, if we think about music in sacred contexts and outside them both, it's been used to sort of work against injustice for a long time. I mean, think about pumping people up with music before protests, keep them going during marches. I remember this incredible experience I had in Washington, D.C. in 2000. I was there protesting the Bush inauguration. And I found out about this concert given by a whole bunch of classical musicians who call themselves Musicians for Social Justice. They were in the DC and Baltimore area. And they gave a concert for the protesters. It was free, and it was music interspersed with speeches by mostly Black politicians from DC and Baltimore. Um, and these musicians gave this beautiful concert of music to soothe our souls as a balm in Gilead, so to speak. And they wouldn't put their names on the program. They said, we are not here to be individual musicians and have our names known and make money. We're here to care for you. And so sometimes comforting the afflicted is justice work. Um, but then, I mean, if you think about the Negro spiritual tradition, and I have been told by African American musicians that Negro spiritual is the best term for that tradition. I mean, it was used historically to help enslaved people escape slavery. You can't get a lot more political than that. If you look at the language codes in those spirituals during the Civil War, those were codes to help people escape and liberate themselves and liberate others. That's phenomenal. Um, so in my own writing, I do address social justice directly sometimes and injustice. I use biblical language to remind us of the prophetic call to work for good. Um, I celebrate and lift up the lives and well-being of devalued people. And I encourage us to have trust and faith that following Jesus means healing and liberating each other so that we all get to have good lives.
So, what does inclusive liturgy look and feel like in practice? And how would there be some examples that you could possibly show? Well, how traditional worship language might, let's see, what unintentionally reinforce exclusion.
Yeah, I'm going to start with the second question. So if
Okay.
we imagine God only as male in worship, if all the language we use for God is male, whether that's spoken words or songs, that reinforces the idea that men are somehow holier or closer to God than women or more like God or something like that. Um, and so that idea then can be used to justify sexism inside and outside of the church. So that's not a good thing. Um, in the Christian tradition and to a little bit of an extent in the Jewish tradition before it, whiteness language has sometimes been used to suggest purity, and darkness or blackness language has been used to suggest sin or difficulty or the absence of goodness. And in a racist society, that's just going to reinforce racism. So that's a problem. Um, and now I'm going to go back to that slightly less comfortable topic of sexuality. So when liturgies condemn certain people based on how they read certain Bible passages, um, such as sexual minorities, then people like me learn that we are bad and that God hates us. I mean, that is the first message I ever got from Christianity, was that I was an abomination, literally. And that has caused untold harm for all sorts of people. I didn't even grow up religious, and yet I still carry religious homophobia inside of myself that I still wrestle with. So that's unfortunate. Um, and so then, what is inclusive liturgy? It is liturgy, prayers, worship songs, and so on that carefully, intentionally, and formally welcome everyone in and affirm that God loves all of us and that all of us have an obligation to each other and that all of us have an opportunity for gratitude and so on. Now, what does that really look like? Sometimes it's changing a single word in a hymn text. I don't know if you've run into the hymn For the Beauty of the Earth. In one of the earlier versions of it, one of the lines read, "For each perfect gift of thine to our race so freely given." Well, that might have worked, 2 centuries ago or whatever. But if I'm going to sing that now, I will change race to lives. For each perfect gift of thine to our lives so freely given. Race is not important there, and it's kind of misleading. Or maybe we're changing a line of music. So Marty Haugen has a wonderful hymn called Gather Us In, and one of the lines in it is, Gather us in, the blind and the lame. Well, that language kind of meant one thing in the time of the Bible, but there are some problems with it now. So when I, use that hymn, I will change that to gather us in, the sad and ashamed. Because anyone, regardless of their race, gender, sexuality, physical ability, or disability, all of us can be sad and ashamed. So we're all welcome to be gathered in our sadness and our shame and so on. Sometimes we write completely new prayers or responsive readings or hymns. Um, I have a responsive reading that's one of the things I have published in A Liturgy for All Bodies called Holy Darkness, Hold Us. And it is a reimagining of darkness as rich and spiritually nurturing and beautiful. And unfortunately, the church needs that because it needs to stop seeing whiteness as good and darkness as bad. Um, I have this language may make you uncomfortable, and I apologize if it does. One of my most frequently published hymns is called Queerly Beloved, and it is sung from the perspective of same-sex loving people. Um, and so, of course, that can be uncomfortable for some people, but I really deeply feel that we are being called into the most inclusive vision of the church and humanity we can come up with. So we have to welcome all sorts of people, including those we are not traditionally very good at welcoming.
Once again, now this might make you a little uncomfortable, but I'm going back to my childhood, and as I said, I also spent a good part of my life on the other side of the tracks. And during my teenage years, people of your ilk were considered prey. You were considered, I mean, uh, who cares if you called the cops? The cops weren't coming. I mean, you were different. You were queer people. I mean, if you weren't down on, in a certain part of Manhattan, you literally were taking your life in your hands. How do we get past? Like I said, uh, I think it has a lot to do with the young people because I think a lot of people my age or maybe even in their 60s are a lot more set in their ways. And I understand you're of a different generation, but is how do we get that? How do we erase that stain and bring the young people together? Because this is what it's all about. It's no longer about us, at least in my perspective.
Well, I think the young people are actually doing a lot better than some of us old fogies are in some regards. But in terms of the more basic question of, how do you move from seeing a certain group of people as outside the norm and not deserving of good treatment? I mean, just like those of us who are white have to do our own wrestling and self-education and work on our discomfort around racism to be part of the solution, heterosexual people who are uncomfortable with same-sex loving people have to do a parallel thing, not necessarily you as an individual, but someone who grows up with those prejudices has to come to see people like me as fully human, as just as complex as you and just as deserving of a good life as you, in the same way that I, as a white person, have to um, learn that, in fact, people with darker skin than me are not, inherently less competent or dangerous or whatever I was taught. So, I mean, the whole point of my book about inequality is that these processes work similarly for different groups of people. So, what actually led me to care about racism the way I do today was realizing that I cared a lot about sexism and homophobia, because I suffer from them. And when I realized that racism had some things in common, I was like, okay, well, if I want men to treat me well, and if I want heterosexual people to treat me well, I better start treating, we back then we would have said people of color well. So we all have an ethical and spiritual opportunity to wrestle with our discomfort, just like Jacob wrestled with God in the Hebrew Bible and got a new name. Well, we can get a new name, and that new name is loving and compassionate and inclusive.
So, for churches or clergy worried about backlash, how do you suggest that they begin engaging with more inclusive liturgy without abandoning their theological roots?
Well, this is easy. Go back to the Bible, because there's this huge prophetic strand in the Bible, and it tells us to care for the devalued. So in the Bible, it talks about foreigners and widows and orphans a lot, but those were the devalued people in that time and place. So how should we interpret that now? Who is devalued in our world today? Everything I do around inclusive liturgy is meant to ask, who is excluded and how do we include them, because the Bible says we should be including them. So there's that piece. um, I think about Jesus and the parable of the judgment of the nations. When the Son of Man comes in all his glory, the nations will sit before him, and he will tell some of them you got some good news, and he'll tell some of them you got some bad news, right? Well, he does not uh, tell the ones who got the good news that they got the good news because they believed the right doctrines about him. It's right there in this story. It's because you treated people well. That's what he says. You treated people well, and in fact, when you treated those people well, he says, you treated me well. And the people who are going to the bad place in that parable, he says, you're going there because you saw hungry people, you didn't feed them, you didn't give the thirsty something to drink, you didn't visit the sick, you didn't visit those in prison, and so on and so on. And they say, he says, so you didn't take care of me. And they say, well, we didn't see you there. And he says, well, when you didn't take care of them, you didn't take care of me. So again, how do we take care of people today? Yes, we should feed the hungry, for sure. House the homeless, for sure. Wrestle with racism in the prison system, for sure. But also make our worship spaces places where everyone can be and learn from each other and wrestle together and so on. So there's that. The other thing about the Bible is there are all sorts of gender diverse images of God in the Bible. We just don't use them, but they're in there. I have a hymn called God the Soaring Eagle, and it's most of the hymn is just a list of different names for God in the Bible. And there are male names, there are female names, there are gender neutral names because they're sort of natural. So, God the Soaring Eagle, um, God the Mountain, that kind of thing. There's racial diversity in the Bible. There's racial diversity in the New Testament. There's even sexuality diversity in the Bible. And we tend not to think about this. But for example, if you think about the story of Joseph in the Hebrew Bible, we know about this multicolored coat he had, right? Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Well, the only place where the kind of coat Joseph had is described anywhere else in the Bible, the Hebrew word refers to a girl's dress, a princess dress. So was Joseph wearing something a little girly? I don't know, but it's the Hebrew makes it sort of. So there's a lot of stuff in the Bible that we can kind of go back to and say, they've wrestled with their versions of this thousands of years ago. We can wrestle with it today. And then once we've gone back to the Bible, we go forward together in discomfort. We treat this as an adventure. We are humble. We learn from each other. We have hard conversations. We hurt each other's feelings and apologize and start again. But I think that's what it's going to need. It's going to need humility and patience and kindness and courage, but it's doable.
Doable. Good word. Good word. Um, so, um, creativity and moral imagination. You also train people to unlock their creativity. What's the relationship between creativity and justice? How does that work in your view?
Well, while creativity can be used for good or evil, creativity and justice work share something really important in common. They're both about creating something new. So creativity in any field or area is about creating something new, and usually that is by bringing together already existing ideas or relationships or materials or something in a new way. And in the same way, justice work starts with the belief that a new and better world that we can't see yet is possible. And then we act on the belief that it's possible by generating new ideas, new relationships, new things, new norms, new laws, whatever it's going to take. So justice work not only is kind of parallel to creativity in its focus on moving into a future that we can't quite see yet, but also justice work really demands creativity because by definition, it's an attempt to create a society we don't live in yet. So I think that's pretty important. And the other thing that I would say is pretty much all social change movements that I am aware of have been really creative. So, the civil rights movement, there was a tremendous amount of creativity in figuring out what kinds of things to do and how to position this movement so that kind of middle of the road American white people would find it compelling. Um, there's a lot of creativity in that. There's a lot of creativity um, in the kind of women's rights movement, in the AIDS activism movement, and in fact, um, just a couple of days ago on Facebook, I saw a picture um, of a Major League Soccer game in Los Angeles, and a bunch of people had gone to the game and sort of taken over a set of the seats that were all together and unfurled this huge banner that said "Abolish ICE." Okay, I don't normally think of going to a sporting event as where I'm going to see a protest. So creativity in justice work has a long, honorable history.
Colin Kaepernick, I can give you some examples, but you know, we do tend to get very creative, uh, like you said, with the way we protest, the way that we uh, make our presence known. But many people assume that creativity is a solo act. You link it to a community transformation. How can churches and organizations better tap into communal creativity for a change?
So they have to start by acknowledging that communal creativity exists and that there can be, when people are working together to be creative, there can be a kind of synchronicity that is more than just the sum of the individual parts. So there's just acknowledging that it's possible. Then I think what they have to do is set up kind of structures or organizations or social containers within which people can work, probably alone some of the time and together some of the time, to solve problems or come up with new ideas or practices or things. And so, um, what I mean by that is sort of putting people in a room with a set of rules. So, for example, one of the rules is no idea is a bad idea. Don't censor yourself. Start by just coming up with whatever you come up with. It can be edited later. It can be analyzed later, right? But let's have a brave space and a safe space where everyone's creativity is welcome, and we are all bringing our creativity to the service of whatever the project is, or the larger good, or the larger goal. We don't have a lot of ego attachment to it, and then once that's set up, people just kind of keep following that process. They stay curious and they stay humble and they focus on it. What's really important, I know we all know this, but I have to say it, is the more different perspectives around the table, the better. So for me, something that's been really interesting in thinking about how different groups of people talk about addressing global climate change, obviously we need natural scientists in the room, of course we do. But we also need social scientists and we need philosophers. We need people who understand how religion works. So the more voices are around the table, the more different professional skills, the more different demographic backgrounds, and even the more political perspectives we have around the table. And that could be controversial. But if we have more different political perspectives around the table, then we're going to surface the objections, and then we can sort of figure out, okay, so, this group is proposing X, but this member of this political group is opposed to X. So how do we talk about that? All of that's really important. And then obviously you need a well-trained and emotionally mature leader who's sort of facilitating this process, who can handle conflict, who isn't attached to a particular agenda, but who, again, is there to just help keep everyone's creativity moving. They have to be trustworthy, they have to be knowledgeable, but basically they have to be prepared to sort of herd cats a little bit, because there are going to be different perspectives in the room. But once you sort of put them in dialogue with each other, you can start coming up with some really good stuff.
So, what are some practical tools or exercises that you use to help people break out of their creative or emotional blocks, especially when they're wrestling with big moral questions? How do you keep that from turning into a Tower of Babel?
Right. So this is going to sound simplistic, but I think when the blocks are emotional, usually emotional healing work of whatever sort is the best thing, whether, therapy, shadow work, internal family systems work, mindfulness meditation, things like that. So if our emotions are blocking our creativity, we have to get our emotions into integrity and alignment. Um, if we have a creative block just because we're sort of running dry, um, we go out and encounter the world. We read some new books. We listen to music that we wouldn't normally listen to. When I was years ago, I would go to record stores and literally read the song titles on the backs of albums to come up with ideas for songs I might write. So
You
just
can read the words right there. The lyrics would be there and everything.
Exactly. It was a fabulous thing. It's not true anymore, but but so input helps with output in a sense. There are a ton of creativity prompts that are sort of out there in the world for specific context. Um, for writing stories, for writing songs, for choreographing dances, and so on. I mean, when I do creativity training, I offer a bunch of my own, materials for that. But I want to focus on your last point, the idea that we need creativity to help us wrestle with big moral questions in our lives. So, yeah, like if I'm struggling over a song lyric, that's not terribly important. If I'm trying to discern the morally right path by which I should live, a big moral question like that, that's huge. And for me, at least, it's really about spiritual practices. That doesn't need to mean religious. For someone, it might mean religious or doctrinal, but practices that get us in touch with whatever that kind of sense of the sacred is that we have access to inside ourselves. Silent meditation, or if you're in a tradition that prays, praying, things like that. Um, we need to be spiritually grounded and centered and in connection with the source of things, however we describe it, if we're going to wrestle with moral questions, or it's going to be too easy for us to sort of fail in our wrestling and do the easier thing. I once heard someone define morality as when you do the right thing, even though no one knows you did it, because it's hard to do the right thing. So if we are spiritually grounded, whatever that means to us, we are more likely to be able to do the right thing,
If someone's watching.
even if someone's not watching. Hey, you haven't given me any hard questions yet. Where's the hard questions?
uh, so you've taken on ethics, inequality, worship, and anti-racism across multiple disciplines. What thought line connects all of this for you, and what's the mission that drives your work across these fields?
So I have experienced a tremendous amount of pain in my life, pain that largely could have been avoided if society were simply organized differently, if it were kinder, if it were more just, if it were more loving. So my mission is to enhance joy, gratitude, wonder, and a sense of abundance for all people, myself included, and to help all people, myself included, experience less pain, less fear, less self-hatred, less self-destructiveness. So if I wanted to put that simply, I'd say my mission is to help all of us flourish more and suffer less.
Um, Once again, I'm going to go back to some personal experiences here. I spent some time being incarcerated, and also some time is in Vietnam, as you can probably see on my shirt.
Mm.
And I guess to get kind of profound, I've seen where men have turned to religion, to God, or whatever deity you want to mention, in times of stress, in times, the guys that are coming in doing life, young men, that are coming in, doing 20 years or more. But how do you and this was something I was skeptical of so many people when I was locked up, because why didn't you turn to Jesus before you got locked up? Why is it now okay when you are when you absolutely you have nowhere else to turn? Now you want to accept this into your life. Now, like I said, call it the pessimist in me, or because I've been one that has always been able to accept the consequences of my actions. So therefore, I don't blame outside resources or outside, even though that they might be. I still feel that I had the power of choice. So how do you, when you talk about white privilege, when you talk about being able to accept uh, uh, religion as it is today, as you say, you change the wording of some songs, of some hymns. We don't sing the second banner of the second stanza of the national anthem. I mean, how do you break out I guess, separate the wheat from the chaff, to put it in biblical terms?
So
There's a question for you.
I come back to Mark 12:28-34, which I mentioned before, the story of Jesus and the scribe, and what are the two greatest commandments. Um, I think the wheat is whatever is loving, and I think the chaff is whatever is hateful or fearful. Because we also see in the first letter of John the idea that perfect love casts out all fear. So we would have to get into a more concrete conversation about how do we define love and how do we know what act is loving, and and that sort of thing.
Well, you
Um,
can come back.
well, yeah, I mean that's, but I do want to say one other thing though, because since you're talking about incarceration, one of the brilliant insights of the lawyer and writer and activist Brian Stevenson in his book Just Mercy is that everyone is more than the worst thing they've ever done. Um, and a lot of us have done some pretty bad things for which we were never in prison because we were, oh, I don't know, white, for example. So there's sort of an unfairness about who gets imprisoned. But even let's say, I have a prisoner friend who he's a lifer, and I've been writing to him and visiting him for 35 years, a little more. And he did a terrible thing a very, very, very long time ago, and he will die in prison and all that. Um, but he is more than that one act. Whatever your circumstances were, and I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't take accountability for harm you've caused. We should all take accountability for harm we've caused. But all of us are also more than the worst thing we've ever done. And so some degree of generosity of spirit toward ourselves and toward each other, I think that is part of what it means to be loving. Not that we shouldn't be held accountable for harm that we cause, but that's not the only or the last thing about us that matters.
I truly understand what you're saying there, which is also why I try to support as many people that are incarcerated that are coming out, simply behind the fact that a lot of the technology is simply put them behind. One last question, though, before we end it, at least uh, this segment. You've had one message for white Christians who want to be allies but don't know how to start. Uh, what would you offer them as uh, not as a guilt, but as guidance?
Sure. I would say Jesus invites those who follow his way into both discomfort and joy. I think if we are serious about trying to follow him, we can't have discomfort without joy, and we can't have joy without discomfort. So this is what I would say to white Christians who want to be allies. First, make a commitment to the self-education and the personal growth and the dealing with discomfort that will start your ally journey, and stick with it, even when it is uncomfortable. Second, remember that no mistake you make, no cringeworthy comment, no stupid sounding observation, no facepalm failure can ever, ever, ever separate you from the love of God. And finally, this topic is a wonderful way to think about the meaning of the idea of repentance. I think I mentioned this before. It doesn't mean beating ourselves up. It doesn't mean hating on ourselves. It means literally turning around, getting a new perspective, following a different path. And these understandings of repentance can help us as we strive to become better white allies. We step off the path of unintentionally reinforcing racism, or worse, intentionally reinforcing it. And we now try to become conscious and to become part of the solution. Um, so that's what I would say.
Uh, Finally, in a time where the church and society seem to be at a crossroads, what gives you hope? And my first, when I first started the podcast, it was during Trump's first term. And one of the topics that I had for a show was, have we weaponized hope? And what would be your take on that? Like I said, what gives you hope, and where do you think we're being invited to go next, ethically, spiritually, and culturally?
So people give me hope, because for all the violence, hatred, cruelty, fascism, and despair, I see so many people doing so many wonderful things for good all the time, and I try to be one of them. And I mean, how wonderful that we're having this conversation right after the No Kings protest. I mean, 13 million people across this country. That's not even counting like Europe. I mean, there are, just in this country alone, 13 million people, you know, showed up, some of them in Minnesota, where they had been warned that it would be dangerous to go to the protest because the shooter was still, hadn't been caught yet, who shot the politicians. Um, that gives me tremendous hope. Something like 12,000 people in my conservative city of Colorado Springs, we all lined up Nevada Avenue, and thousands of cars honked and cheered at us. That gives me hope. As long as we are still breathing, we are still capable of doing good in the world, however modestly. Any of us can start over at any point. Any of us can repent, change our ways, do better, work harder, whatever it means. And that doesn't even have to be religion. That can just be being more politically involved, taking better care of the planet, whatever. We always have an opportunity for a new beginning. And as for where we're being invited to go next, I happen to be, you might have guessed this by now, a huge fan of musicals. And I always come back to my favorite line from the musical Rent, which is right toward the end of the show: give in to love or live in fear. And that reminds us of the line from the first letter of John that I mentioned a minute ago: there is no fear in love, for perfect love casts out fear. So the crossroads we are at offers us two options, and I think two only: love or fear. Or if we wanted to put it differently, it offers us either abundance or scarcity. However else we try to describe the situation, it's going to come back to those two pairings. We choose love or we choose fear, we choose abundance or we choose scarcity. And each choice will have ethical implications, spiritual implications, cultural, political, economic implications. We don't have time to discuss them. But I think choosing love is almost always harder than choosing fear. That may never have been as true as it is today, but it certainly is true today. But we can choose love, and I hope we will.
Are you
Choo-
afraid to use the word hate?
um, no, I could say love versus hate. That'd be okay. But I think hatred is grounded in fear.
I
So
yes.
but fine. Let's say we can choose love or we can choose hate. That's fine. I hope we will choose love. Choosing abundance over scarcity requires an almost unbelievable amount of trust, but we can choose abundance, and I hope we will. And that's the best I can do with that question.
It's, no, I know I've kept you over a little bit longer than I promised, but
All good.
I would like to invite you back. And it's interesting that we're all talking about the events of this weekend, and I published a very short video on YouTube because I went to the Veterans Hospital uh,
Hmm.
Friday, and then I had to go back for a separate appointment uh, today. And the note that I put up said that there are no eggs due to, first, a shortage of staff to make omelets, and number two, because there's an egg shortage. I want to understand how the Department of Defense can spend almost $234 million over the weekend, but a veteran can't get a boiled egg. Just something to think about. I published it. Yeah, I mean, you know. Once again, I want to thank you for your time. I want you make sure you tell our audience where they can find you, where your works are. You have so many things out there that can be of assistance and a resource for my audience. Please tell us more about where we can find your work, more about yourself, any websites,
Sure.
anything that you may have.
So I have three primary places that I make my different kinds of work available. I have a website focused on my writing, and the URL for it is simply amandaudiskessler.com, literally. So If you look at my name on the screen right now and you take the hyphen out of my last name and just jam it all together as one word, AmandaUniskessler.com, you'll get my writing. I'm working on getting a training website set up, but that's not ready yet. My music is all on a website. And again, I'm going to have to apologize. Some people might find this uncomfortable, but that website URL, where all my music is freely available, so anyone can listen to anything, download anything, watch videos, whatever. The URL is queersacredmusic.com, QUEERSACRED, music.com. And finally, I have a pretty active and busy YouTube channel. So if you go to just YouTube and search for Amanda Unis-Kessler, you do need both of my names. I have several hundred videos there. Many of them are music videos, so they're often worship songs or justice songs. But I also have some sermons up there. I have some talks I've given on my books up there. I have some trainings up there. So if you're looking for sort of a diverse set of what I do, the YouTube channel is a good start. If you're just interested in writing, AmandaUniskessler.com. If you're just interested in the music, queersacredmusic.com.
Do you have anything in the works?
Um, I have 4 book proposals that I would like to start writing one of these days. For the 2 publishers that published my books in 2024, the sociology book and the religion book, they've both invited me to submit new proposals. So I'm just trying to get back to that.
Now, are these college grade manuals, or are they, how-to books? What would?
So the sociology book would be about the ethics of inequality. So actually, a lot of stuff we've talked about today, but um, I in neither of the other books that I had come out recently did I really have the word count freedom to write as much as I wanted about that. So I want to write a whole book about why
Audible,
inequality is ethically wrong. Um,
Audible.
the others are all religion books. So I have a Lenten devotional I'd like to write. I have a book on how to love our enemies that I'd like to write. I have a book on abundance versus scarcity mindsets from a religious perspective that I'd like to write. We'll see.
Well, a lot to keep up with there. And once again, I'd like to thank you for your time. And I hopefully we would like to have you back on the program.
I'd be delightful.
Well, thank you so much. You have a great evening, and I appreciate your time, as we said before. So, have a great night, and I
As well.
appreciate your works also. I hope all of my audience will at least come and look at it with an open mind. And to me, it doesn't, we're all human beings. We all, even though I'm not a practicing person, but I do remember there a line, we all fall short of the glory of. So I'll end with that.
All right.
You
Have a
have a
good
great
night.
night.
All right.
Appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.